Perfect.
Okay, so the next talk will be given by Hendrik Molter. Hendrik is a postdoc at HPI. He just moved next door to me pretty much, and we talk every day. So today he will be talking to us about minimum temporal spanners in happy graphs. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. We've already heard a lot about spanners today, so I think I don't need to give a big motivational introduction, but I guess all of you know spanning trees and static graphs, and they are one of the arguably most fundamental primitives in algorithmic graph theory that we have. And there are several classic algorithms to compute them, and temporal spanners are in some sense the most, or arguably the most natural generalization to the temporal setting. And sorry. Yeah, and before I continue with more definitions, I also have one slide to introduce the notation that I'm going to use, which is very similar to what we've seen before. Well, yeah, a temporal graph is a graph where the edges have labels, and we can talk about layers and an underlying graph. I'm going a little bit quickly here because I assume that you all know this or have seen this very recently in other talks. And then if you talk about connectivity in temporal graphs, the main thing to take care of here is that we can talk about non-strict connectivity, where you are allowed to take several steps at the same time, like in this example here, or strict connectivity, where at each edge that you take has to have a strictly larger label than the previous one. Okay. And then temporal connectivity has a few properties which makes it a little bit difficult to handle sometimes. So in contrast to the static case, temporal connectivity is not symmetric and also not transitive. The symmetry is, you have an example here where you can get from A to B, but not from B back to A. This is very similar to the directed graph case. But the thing that seems to make temporal connectivity related problems inherently difficult is the non-transitive nature of temporal connectivity. So here you can see you can get from A to B, you can get from B to C, but you cannot get from A to C. And yeah, that, as I already said, that seems to be one of the reasons many temporal graph problems that are related to connectivity are much harder than their static counterparts. Okay, so now what is a temporal spanner? So we say that the temporal graph is temporally connected, or TC, if between all pairs of vertices there exist temporal paths in both directions. So you can get from any vertex A to any vertex B. And then the computational problem that I'm interested in this talk here is the following. We get a temporal graph as input, and we are kind of promised that this is temporally connected already. And we get some integer k if we want to treat it as a decision problem. And then our task is to compute a spanning subgraph, meaning a graph that still contains all of the vertices, that is temporally connected and has size k. And the size can either mean the number of time edges or the number of labels that we want to use, but it can also mean the number of edges of the underlying graph. Both of those versions have been considered in the literature. Okay. And this gives us now 4 problem variants in total, because you can combine the connectivity type with what you consider the size of the spanner, and for each version you have 2 options. Okay. Now, Title also talked about happy graphs, and what we want to look at are certain natural temporal graph classes where some of these differences kind of coincide to the same problem or to the same notion, let's say. And one very popular restriction is simple temporal graphs, where every edge is only allowed to have one label, like in this example here. And then it's quite easy to realize that there's no difference now between having a spanner with k labels or having a spanner where the underlying graph has k edges, because in that case, every edge has exactly one label. And then there are temporal graphs which are typically called proper. And their property is that if I look at a single vertex, all the edges incident with that vertex have different labels. The naming comes from the idea that if you treat the labels as colors, then this is a proper edge coloring. So in this example here, we can see that this temporal graph is proper. If you look at it for a little bit, you will realize that there's no vertex that has two incident edges with the same label. And if you think about proper temporal graphs, what does it mean? It means essentially that every snapshot or every layer, however you want to call it, is a matching. So you can never go more than one step at one time, which means there's no difference between strict and non-strict connectivity. And now we call temporal graphs happy if they're both simple and proper, like in this example here. And the nice thing about this that all four problem variants now coincide to the same problem on these types of temporal graphs. Okay, so what is known about temporal spanners as a computational problem? So there are a bunch of results here that hold for certain types of temporal graphs, even though they are not necessarily called like that in all of these works. So temporal spanners kind of independently have been shown to be NP hard to compute by Axiotis and Fotakis and Akrida and others, where Axiotis and Fotakis, their reduction showed that it's NP hard for simple graphs, but not proper temporal graphs. And they considered non-strict temporal connectivity. And because the graphs are simple, it's both for minimum labels and minimum number of edges in the temporal graph. And then the other hardness result by Akrida and others produced a graph that is not simple and not proper, but they considered strict connectivity and the minimum number of labels. And I should say that both of these papers, what they actually show is stronger than NP hardness. They show that also the optimization version is APX hard, among other things, of course, also. And then a little bit more recently, there is a paper by Castells and others that show that that the not simple but proper case for both versions of connectivity now, because the graphs are proper, the minimum edge version of the problem is NP hard. And the main result in our work is now that we show that computing minimum spanners is NP hard on on happy graphs, which combines essentially all of the previous results, at least if we only are interested in NP hardness. Okay. And on the algorithmic side, to the best of my knowledge, there is only one exact algorithm in the literature for computing minimum temporal spanners. And this is by Axiotis and Fotakis, who showed that the problem is polynomial time solvable if the underlying graph is a tree. They showed that for the non-strict setting, but it's relatively easy to see that their algorithm also works in the strict setting, and both for minimum label and minimum edge. Okay. And what I also briefly want to discuss, just not to neglect it, there's a long lineage of research on temporal spanners that approach the problem more from a graph theoretical point of view. I don't want to give a full review of the results here because that would be out of scope for my talk. But specifically, there is a lot of research on how sparse spanners can be on so-called temporal cliques, meaning that the underlying graph is complete. and also other related results. One that I want to mention is that in this early work by Axioutis and Fotakis, they also showed that there are temporal graphs that do not admit sparse temporal spanners, where you need a quadratic number of edges to maintain connectivity, and you cannot delete any of the edges without destroying the connectivity for at least one vertex pair. And just to also mention, there's a lot of work on related problems. So first of all, in this early work, there was also an edge-weighted variant that was considered. There's work on finding temporal spanners where the underlying graph of the spanner is restricted to be a tree. There's also a lot of work on spanners that approximately preserve distances, and also work on spanners that, on top of that, also tolerant to blackout, which means, if I remember correctly, that essentially that single snapshots can deactivate, and after that you still would like to have connectivity. And as we also have seen in a previous session, there's a lot of work on the enumeration of temporal spanners. Okay, but now let's get to the results of our work. So as I already mentioned, our main result is that minimum temporal spanners NP-hard on happy temporal graphs. And as a corollary from the reduction, we also get that computing a two-source spanner, meaning that there are two vertices that should reach everybody else, is NP-hard on happy graphs, which was a bit surprising to us, even more so than that spanners are NP-hard. On the positive side, we could show that computing a minimum temporal spanner on happy graphs is polynomial time solvable if the underlying graph has a constant vertex cover number. Or in the language of parameterized algorithms, we give an XP algorithm for the vertex cover number of the underlying graph as a parameter. And as a lower bound, we could only, in some sense, show so far that minimum temporal spanner, when you want to minimize the number of labels, is W1 hard when parameterized by the vertex cover number, but also only on proper graphs. So you can see there's quite a big gap between the lower bound and the upper bound in terms of the parameterized complexity of this problem. And what I want to do in the remaining time is show you how this XP algorithm works. I also have a backup slide on the NP hardness reduction, but I'm almost sure I will not have time to talk about this. Okay, so this XP algorithm uses, in my opinion, very nice structural properties of temporal spanners that I want to introduce. And for that, I need to talk about temporal out trees. It's a very simple concept. They are rooted at a vertex V, and they are minimal temporal graphs in terms of the number of time edges or labels, in which that vertex V, the root, can reach still all the other vertices in the graph. And the lemma that we could show, which we call the VC vertex cover tree lemma, is that if you have a happy graph with a vertex cover of size D, and you take a minimum spanner of that graph, then the spanner has the following property. The spanner is essentially composed of D temporal out trees, each of which is rooted at one of the vertex cover vertices, and then at most one extra edge for each of the vertices in the independent set that are not in the vertex cover. And what I would like to do is to prove this lemma, and from that, the algorithm follows almost immediately. Okay, so how can we see that this makes sense? So let's say we have a vertex, so I use here VC to denote the vertex cover, and we consider a minimum spanner of a given input temporal graph, which is happy. That's also important. And now what we can do is we look at all these temporal out trees rooted at independent set vertices. We know that they need to exist because it's a spanner, so all the independent set vertices can reach everybody else. And now if I look at this temporal out tree, then if it's rooted at some vertex v, there's one of the independent of the vertex cover vertices, which is the earliest one that is reached, right? And now I associate that independent set vertex with this vertex of the vertex cover, right? And this gives me a partition of the independent set vertices. And now I can look at a certain partition, so that set Vx here, where all the independent set vertices that in their respective temporal out tree, X was the first vertex cover vertex that they reach. Among all of those, I look at the one that reaches X at the latest point in time, that has the largest label when going to X. Let that be V star. And now I look at the temporal out tree rooted at V star. And now I know this temporal out tree can reach everybody else, right? But because we are undirected here, I can just reroute this temporal out tree to X, and then I get a temporal out tree at X that can also reach everybody else. But now also V star was the latest vertex out of all the vertices in Vx that reached X. So yeah, so I already said that. So all the other vertices in Vx, what they can do now, they can just use their edge to X, which we know is earlier than the edge that V star used to get to X. And then from there, reach everybody else, right? So basically, all the vertices in Vx use the same out tree T with at most one additional edge, which is the one from themselves to the vertex X. So if I take this for all of the partition, this gives me a temporally connected graph, and which is a subgraph of my spanner, but because I assume my spanner is minimal, it has to be the spanner itself. So I can assume that my minimum temporal spanner looks exactly like that. It's composed out of D temporal out trees, each rooted at one of the vertex cover vertices, plus at most one extra edge from each of the independent set vertices. And now, here is the lemma again. Now I can do the following. I can just compute a minimum vertex cover. I can guess the temporal out tree for each of the vertex cover vertices. I can guess at most one extra edge for each of the independent set vertices. I can define this as a spanner, and I can check whether this has the correct size and it's actually temporally connected. And now, as maybe the last missing piece, it's maybe not completely obvious why these guessing steps are all doable within XP running time. In particular, the second one. But for the second one, we just need the small observation that an out tree rooted at X can only be a tree with a bounded vertex cover number, because the whole graph has bounded vertex cover number. That means that it has at most 2 times the number of vertex cover, or 2 times the size of vertex cover number inner vertices. So I can basically guess the whole structure of the tree except for the leaves, which are in the independent set. And then I can go to all the independent set vertices, of which I know they all have degree at most vertex cover number, because those are the only vertices they are allowed to be connected to. And then for each of them, I can just guess to which of the inner vertices or which of the vertex cover vertices they connect as leaves. And this gives me an overall procedure with which I can guess basically how these out trees look like. Okay. So this gives me an overall running time of n to the order x, where x is a minimum vertex cover. And, well, the correctness follows from basically directly from this VC tree lemma. Yes. Yes. Did I mess up my explanation here? Yeah. I think the way I explain it, it doesn't make sense. So for how much time do I have? Yeah. I mean,
I believe it's doable.
yes. No, but yeah, you're definitely right. The way I explained it is not correct, and for some reason I'm blanking on the correct explanation right now. But maybe you can probably even do it kind of readily, just because once you guess the structure, you know how the labels inside the tree look like, and then you can see, and it doesn't really matter to which of the inner vertices you connect as long as your label is large enough. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, and that's basically what I wanted to show you. So to conclude, the main results of our paper is this NP hardness for happy graphs, which I also forgot to mention or forgot to put on the slides. It was explicitly asked as an open question in previous works. Then we showed this XP algorithm with parameter vertex cover, and then I told you we have the W1 hardness for feedback vertex number, but actually in ongoing work, so we conjecture, we are fairly confident we can show together with Michel that we can get a stronger hardness result. It actually shows also W1 hardness with the vertex cover number on happy graphs, which was show that for the parameter vertex cover number, this XP algorithm is the best we can do up to running time improvements. But of course, there are still questions that we can ask. So first of all, can we generalize this XP algorithm for non-happy graphs? Can we get XP algorithms for smaller parameters? This we also cannot rule out. And also, can we do something similar on directed graph? Because if you remember, one of the central arguments in this lemma is that we can reroute these out trees, which we cannot do anymore necessarily in directed graphs. Okay, here's a link to the manuscript, and thank you.
Thank you, Hendrik, for this very nice talk. Are there any questions? Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, apologies.
In fact, you already asking the future work. I was just wondering, like, have you ever tried other parameter like tree width, try to get an XP algorithm in this?
Yes. So what we tried to do, so I mean, it's not so difficult to see that this problem is in FPT if you combine tree width with the number of labels, for example, because you can formulate this in MSO, then you can get it for free with Cosel's theorem, and it's also not so difficult to get an dynamic program on the tree decomposition when you're also allowed to have the number of labels. But this, we could not get this to an XP algorithm for tree width. So we tried to look closely into how the dynamic program on a tree decomposition looks like. And that was something that had running time, number of labels to the number of labels times tree width squared. I think at least we didn't manage to get the number of labels out of the exponent of the running time. So, but we also don't have a lower bound. So this is open as far as we know.
Thank you.
So let me ask, where did you need the simple part of the graph for the XP algorithm? Like the proper thing I see, but where is the simple part needed?
Yeah, this is. So the simple, I think there are some subtle cases. So first of all, I'm actually fairly convinced that it also works if it's not simple. But at the moment, there are some edge cases, I think, here where we use it. Like, for example, here, when we say there's at most one extra edge for every. So basically what we assume is that if I now look at the out tree at V star, that it doesn't reach the other vertices that are in Vx through X. Because I mean, theoretically, if that edge here had two different labels, although even then, I think the statement should still hold.
How about enumerating all the out trees? Would that be more difficult if it was proper?
Yes. Well, I mean, yeah, good point. I mean, that's for the lemma, that's, I guess, not relevant. Yeah, but this guessing step here assumes that once we know how the structure looks like of this out tree, that it's already immediately clear which labels we use. Thank you. Good point. This is where, although even then, if you only aim at XP time, I guess you could also then guess which of the labels you want to use. So maybe it still works.
Okay, I guess there's some
anyway,
penalties that
this is to make it work for non-simple, I would be almost sure that you can make this work. I think there are only, maybe we use it at some minor technical things that I am forgetting right now, but there I would be fairly confident. It gets a little bit more difficult if it's not proper anymore.